Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the report. Tonight we'll be doing three segments and one additional feature that we've added to the show called Debate Time. And that will feature a 15-minute long debate on various different opinionated topics with two different speakers at the end of each episode. But for today's episode, our first segment is going to be discussing Biden's veep-stakes. Who will Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee for president, select as his vice presidential nominee? There was a lot of speculation today that Joe Biden would announce a nominee, but as of yet, a nominee has not been announced. Over the past few days, Kamala Harris has seemed to have fallen from her original pedestal as favorite to be vice president, with various different contenders seeming to arise out of the blue. Speculation shifted to Susan Rice over the last few days, after which speculation shifted to Gretchen Whitmer, who, although she is not a person of color, is still a woman and a viable contender to be vice president if Biden selects her. And also in the background, who seems to have fallen slightly during this time, is Karen Bass, Congresswoman from California. Uh, Talking about Biden's veep-stakes with us tonight, we have Peter, who talked about it with us last week, and we hope to see if any of his opinions or insight have changed since last week, given some of the new developments. Welcome, Peter. We're happy to have you on stream tonight.
Happy to be here. Pleasure.
Yeah, so could you basically tell us what you think about the developments that have gone on in terms of the speculation surrounding Biden's VP selection over the last week?
I think it's been quite robust and changing, it seems, by the passing day. As you noted, I think Kamala Harris has really fallen from being almost a certain not vice presidential choice to now a lot of more questions are being raised with the imminent decisions more than certainly coming this week.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. I mean, we've seen Kamala Harris for sure go from being the favorite, and some argue she still is the favorite because, after all, speculation generated from people tracking FlightAware and coming up with theories
Right.
and listening to other Twitter accounts, it's all just speculation. And no one
So,
really knows for sure who Biden's going to select. I mean, for all we know, he could just pick Kamala Harris anyway. But in your opinion now, since we spoke last week, given the developments, who would you rank as the new favorite to be selected as Biden's running mate?
I really think, and I know this may be a bit of a surprise, and I was one who always thought Biden would stick with Harris. I really feel like Susan Rice is really the new favorite. I think her connection with Joe, having served together in the Obama administration, I think really gives her the final edge, which usually historically is what comes down to these selections.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to note. Um, Although there have been some on the left who have brought up concern about picking Susan Rice, particularly because conservatives and the conservative media, even though they don't necessarily represent the public, may consistently attack her as they did Hillary Clinton for the whole Benghazi scandal involved in the Obama administration. So if Susan Rice is picked, do you think Susan Rice brings any additional baggage to the ticket that Kamala Harris wouldn't bring? Because both have arguably some scandals. I mean, every politician does. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I think, yeah, she brings her baggage on Benghazi and how she handled that, no doubt. But I think and Harris will bring her own baggage from when she was
Record as Attorney General is basically where most of the beef is coming from in terms of.
and some and some who may criticize her office in San Francisco for going after weed convictions. But I think I just think what's hurt Kamala Harris specifically, what's been coming out leaking, it seems strategically from bigger heads at the Biden team, is that a lot of people inside that campaign don't seem to trust her, which is a very dangerous thing to have if any senior advisors of Joe Biden don't see her as the person best fit to be with Joe. I think that is she a risk? Yes, but I also think she's more of the, if you're Joe, it basically means you're the one in charge because she's going to be a loyalist and she has nothing higher to go off, unlike the other contenders on the list.
Do you think that if Susan Rice were selected and became vice president, would she use it as a springboard potentially for a presidential run, or do you view her as not having those kinds of aspirations?
I don't think she has a presidential aspirations. I think for her being the vice president and being able to do more foreign policy in that role, sort of like a Dick Cheney type vice president with an influence, but not really seeking higher ground than that, I think that for her would be pretty fine. If she's the vice president and having a very big say over U.S. policy.
Mm-hmm. And so far, when we're looking at another contender who seems to have risen in the last few weeks or the last few days really, is Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. What is your opinion on her chances in terms of being selected? I mean, there's been a lot of speculation that Biden's nominee would end up being a woman of color, and Gretchen Whitmer is white. But is it possible that Biden just picks a woman? Because he officially stated his only qualification for selecting the running mate was that she would have to be a woman.
I think Whitmer has done. I think her chances have gone up very well. I mean, she sort of was almost a up and down nominee back in the early spring. She was talked about, but then moved on when the George Floyd protests occurred. But she seems to have reoccurred. I think in large part because I think a lot of people on the Biden team have wanted to expand the field of who to look for, and I think she's checked off a lot of lists. She's a woman. She has executive experience both as a governor and in the state legislature. I think she brings obviously the Midwestern appeal, where this election is arguably going to be won and lost for Joe Biden. So I think if I'm her, I feel, a little bit on the, dark horse thing, but I would feel confident possibly of pulling maybe a big surprise. I think she adds, an executive experience that Democrats tend to not get on their vice presidential tickets.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, as we've mentioned earlier weeks ago on this program, Democrats, the VP nominee in every election since 1988 has been a senator for the Democrats. So they've never had really that executive experience. And usually, if you look at presidential elections, at least recently, some of the more successful contenders are usually governors. Barack Obama is an exception, obviously, to that. But you obviously had President Clinton and President Bush, who both had executive experience in that regard. Now, Whitmer would be a VP nominee, not a presidential nominee. But I mean, executive experience would probably certainly be valuable because Joe Biden has never served in. He served as vice president, but he's never served as a governor or a mayor or any kind of executive office officially until he becomes president. But I think, and just to hear your thoughts on this, I mean, as you brought up, she does bring a Midwestern appeal. She did perform very well against Bill Schuette in that gubernatorial election in 2018 after 8 years of Rick Snyder. And she won a lot of counties and a lot of precincts, if you go down to that level, that Hillary Clinton simply didn't win. So some would argue already that Michigan, since Trump has essentially stopped advertising in Michigan, and many pundits are now moving it to lean or likely Democratic, leading some to believe that it's basically a fluke state like Obama's win in Indiana in 2008, and that Trump isn't really seriously contesting Michigan as a necessary state to his victory this time. And Whitmer theoretically would help even more on top of Biden's current leads in Michigan. And possibly, although we could never know this for sure, but it's possible that Whitmer may help in other areas of the Rust Belt. What's your thought on that?
I mean, yeah, I think obviously Michigan has looked for the last few weeks pretty dire for the Trump campaign, and obviously their actions money wise have sort of proven that they are not very confident of the state. But I think Whitmer brings what so far the other contenders don't have, and that's a Midwestern appeal. Maybe it's not Michigan that it helps, but it goes to Wisconsin maybe or Iowa. Places where whether it's fair or not, Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine did not very much give people an inspiration to vote for them. In her case, she and Joe, if they play their cards right, can say we're this working class Democratic ticket that can give you a shot in an economic environment that is very not friendly for the country at the current moment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the economy is being held down by the pandemic, and it would happen regardless of who's president, basically. But it certainly isn't helping the Trump campaign, considering his argument is the economy. And it's important to note that the stock market is doing very, very well, which is definitely appeasing some of Trump's middle class to upper middle class base that invest in the stock market. But in terms of some of those people in the Rust Belt states that are ancestrally Democratic but voted for Trump last time in the working class level, people that do blue collar jobs, a lot of those people simply aren't involved in the stock market. So they would rather see unemployment going down, which it did, but we're still down many jobs from where we were back in February. And I think eventually we'll recover from that. But the question is, will the economy recover or get worse ahead of the election in November? And my other question to you when we're looking at Gretchen Whitmer as a possibility, do you think Whitmer can help Biden pull out even more African American votes and raise turnout in Wayne County in Michigan? Because as you know, in 2016, Hillary Clinton only lost Michigan by under less than 1%, an incredibly narrow margin, largely because she underperformed President Obama by about 7 points among black voters in Wayne County, which is Detroit. So, do you think that Biden, with his relationship with Obama and potentially Whitmer, who performed well in the county in her gubernatorial race, could really help drive the state towards the Democrats?
I think with the African American vote, I think regardless of who becomes the VP, I think just having Barack Obama very much campaign with him and say, Joe was a loyal VP under me. I think that's enough. I think to get a lot of the African American turnout out. I think, and I think I said this last week, was I don't really think VPs add dynamics in terms of turnout. I just
Yeah.
think VPs are just there, to tell the country, this is the person who I trust. Okay, something horrible were to happen, and this person I think is qualified to be there. I think Whitmer, again, on a conventional list, she, checks off everything you would want on a VP. It just is the question of whether Joe sticks to, it's not his pledge, but basically, what, a lot of Democratic insiders have wanted and politicians is that a person of color, a woman of color, is the
Yeah.
nominee. So that I think is going to be the big, testing of what, he keeps that pledge, or does he flip it around?
Yeah, well, some of the people who are subtly backing Whitmer for the vice presidency have pointed out that, or even if they're not backing, they're just pointing out that if she becomes vice president, if Joe Biden wins the election in November, then her lieutenant governor, who's African American, would become Michigan's first African American governor. So it's not like they're getting the people who wanted Biden to pick a person of color. They're still going to get a person of color in a governor's mansion in a historic way. So potentially that could be something that could make the picking of Whitmer less agonizing for them. And at the end of the day, most voters, most Democrats, most people in both parties, and this goes for the political insiders and the common people, more so for the common people, they don't really care who's selected for vice president at the end of the day, because it may not impact them until the current president is gone and that person runs for office. But yeah, as you talked about, I think it's important to note that a lot of people don't care about the VP selection. And at the end of the day, the VP usually doesn't bring a tremendous amount to the ticket, potentially some regional advantages like Whitmer in Michigan. Um, if you picked Harris, it's debated how much he would help boost minority turnout around the country. But obviously, a state like California is already in the fold. So not quite like Michigan, even though some would argue that it's already in the Democratic column. But real quick, just we have about 5 minutes left in the segment, and one more thing about Whitmer, and then we'll move on. Basically, when you're looking at Gretchen Whitmer during the past few months as governor, she's really had a mix of things going on that, in a way, kind of model the United States as a whole. I mean, there have been ardent supporters of mask wearing in Michigan and limiting distancing and shopping, and at the same time, there were quite a few riots from conservatives who were countering her orders as too anti-business, her safety orders, and she's dealt with kind of both sides of the coronavirus debate. So, do you think that in any way makes her more qualified to be next in line to be an executive for the whole country, or do you think that it basically? Do you think that having pertinent experience in a governor's mansion of a big state like Michigan helps you and gives you experience if you ever become president?
I think, yeah, I think in a state, like Michigan, with all the complexities of it, I think, yes, it does have helping hands for, the office of vice presidency or the presidency. I think with her handling of COVID, obviously that's a very polarizing topic depending on who you ask in Michigan. I know some who don't like it and some who do. I think, and that's also another thing I think will be factored in, whether it's dangerous or appropriate to put a governor on the ticket just because of one mistake possibly in the next few months. If she was governor, hypothetically, let's just say, goes wrong in Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
she's going to get the otis for it, and it could cause the campaign unnecessary headaches.
Yeah, and there currently isn't really any evidence to suggest that Whitmer would become a reverse Sarah Palin, because Sarah Palin, when she was governor of Alaska, ended up harming McCain's campaign more than helping it, at least with the general election electorate, even though she helped with the Tea Party electorate in the primaries that were somewhat hesitant of McCain, who had that maverick conservative image. But looking at Whitmer, If she's selected as vice president, obviously we can't in the media leave out the possibility that something will happen because we don't know whether or not it will. But I mean, currently she is fairly popular despite some drawing the ire, some national conservatives who have essentially called her ridiculously harsh on businesses and on protesters that were protesting her distancing orders. But I think that's a good point. So we've got about 4.5 minutes left in this segment. So just going forward, I mean, at the very end, we're going to do what we did last time and rank the contenders. But we also, I just wanted to bring up the fringe possibility, and I know this goes against Biden's promise, and we've already at Elections Daily had some agreements that this is probably not a VP meeting, but people have been tracking FlightAware, and they saw that a flight from South Bend to Delaware flew today, and that led to some speculation that Pete Buttigieg might get picked for the vice presidency. And some of us have agreed that I know Adam Trencher brought this up that it's potentially a cabinet appointment rather than a VP selection, considering it would go against Biden's promise. So, just real quick, do you think there's any chance at all that he bucks his promise and picks a man for vice president, or do you think he's just going to stick with it, fearing that the electorate may, at least the party mainstream electorate, may harshly criticize?
I don't think Pete's getting nominated at all. I think it's fair to say it's maybe a cabinet role. It's not impossible to say he went to South Bend using it as a cover for something else. Who knows? I mean, John McCain was famous for doing this in 2008. But I think it just would look very weak on Biden's part to have said very early on and very very much hard set in stone, I'm going to choose a woman and backtrack. It just doesn't. It would not make his image look well. It would make him look weak and wobbly in the eyes of the voters he may need to win over to get the election.
Especially given the criticism from conservatives that Biden isn't fit to be president at this point, which they've driven as one of their main messages. I mean, President Trump has used it a lot in his attack ads, and I would agree that Biden doing that would just fuel Trump's image as Biden as an indecisive leader who's kind of past his prime. So when we look at the VP selection here, going into the last 2 minutes of our segment, which two contenders, or not which two contenders, but like we did last week, how would you rank? I don't know, 5 or so contenders, kind of what we have on our graphic here: Bass, Rice, Whitmer, and Harris, or anyone else you want to add. How would you rank them going forward in terms of likeliness to become VP nominee?
I think I would say 1 through 3 are the almost certain people to get it. My view is I think Rice will get it in the end. I think second, very close, is Kamala Harris. I think she's still there, but I think there's been a bit of a fall in the last few days. I also would say as well, number 3 would be Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Whitmer. I think she has done good final few good roadie up to that position. I think 4 is I don't think she was on the list, but I would say Tammy Duckworth, just because her name keeps getting floated in some circles. So I'd say she would get it. And I think number 5, but I think she's been the leaks against her have been very vicious and probably have done their job, is Karen Bass, but I don't think she's done herself any favors with 2 weak interviews on both Meet the Press and Fox News Sunday.
And one other contender that's kind of popped up in some speculation is the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo. Do you think there's any scent of evidence to that in terms of her being a potential pick?
I don't think a VP at all. I think just her views on unions would probably scare off of Democrats, but I think it wouldn't be surprising to maybe see her get a role somewhere in a future Biden administration should that happen.
Yeah, so real quick as we wrap up the segment, when we're looking at the VP selection, it's certainly very interesting, and hopefully it'll be coming in the next few days. But the main thing that you seem to have changed on from our interview last week is that you now think Susan Rice has overtaken Kamala Harris in terms of being the favorite for the nomination.
Yes.
So thank you, Peter. We appreciate you coming on for this segment. We hope to hear from you more in future episodes. So it's been nice having you.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. All right, we're going to be moving on to our next segment now on the political implications of reopening schools this November and what it may mean for President Trump seeking re-election and other down ballot possibilities in various elections across the country. And for this segment, which is 10 minutes, we're going to be welcoming Adam Trencher, part of the staff at Elections Daily, with us today. Welcome, Adam. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you, Harrison. I'm happy to be here.
All
Uh,
right, yeah, we're happy to have. Yeah, so if you could just start off and give us a rundown of what you think so far of the situation in terms of schools reopening around the country from what you've seen, and how you think so far it would affect the political environment in November.
sure. So with this, it's worth dividing it into K through 12 education and higher education, with the reason in being that K through 12 education, the impact there exclusively impacts parents, whereas with higher education, you see the impact on the students as well, which is why it forms useful dividing line. So starting with the K through 12 education, I think it's a lose-lose for Trump no matter what happens with schools reopening. If schools don't reopen, Trump is giving up the narrative that he has coronavirus under control, and it makes him look weak and ineffective, particularly as you'll see schools abroad going back. I don't know these school schedules in, say, the UK or France or Germany, but I'd imagine that they'll have significantly more ease in reopening schools, and to not have schools reopen makes Trump look comparatively weak. But if schools do reopen, it's extremely likely that you're going to see a spike in cases. On a bit of a case study, Pittsburgh during the Spanish flu, because their school boards were independently controlled of the city, even though the city shuttered most of its stuff. The school board demanded schools remain open for weeks, which is how Pittsburgh became one of the epicenters in the Spanish flu, just because these schools became a massive vector of transmission of it. So you're going to see a similar thing if you keep the schools open with COVID. And while there's not directly risk implications to students in the same way that there are to older populations, if students get it, they're going to go home, they're going to give it to their parents, they're going to give it to their grandparents, they could give it to immunocompromised relatives or if the students, and that's going to be disastrous. You're going to see a spike in cases, spike in hospitalizations, spike in deaths, and the schools are going to close probably by Halloween, by and large, at the latest. And if that happens, Trump has not only given up the narrative that he has it under control, but he's now seemed actively incompetent and that he has cost the lives of Americans by advocating that schools be reopened. I mean, if he does that and this wasn't a disease, you'd see people marching in the streets going, hey, Donnie J, how many grandmas did you kill today? Hey, just, it's people will just find it unacceptable even beyond what we've already seen if the schools reopen and you have this spike. And then moving on to the higher education implications. Kraz Granitz, who writes for Elections Daily, has actually wrote a great article on how college campuses don't cast as many votes as you think, and they're not as important. So I do agree with his analysis nationally, congressionally. Legislatively, you have more of an impact. Say if Penn State and University Park opens or doesn't open, having students on campus probably materially benefits the whoever state representative is running in the Penn State-based district. But if it doesn't reopen. But by and large, you'll see little electoral impact for the reason that most college students are registered home. College students who are registered turn out pretty poorly, and they're not as uniformly Democrat as you might think.
Yeah, I think you brought up some good points there, some interesting points. But one thing I wanted to ask you as well is if schools do reopen initially, before we see a large spike in cases nationally, do you think President Trump will try and use that positively to his campaign's advantage? And adding to that, if schools don't reopen, which could harm potential economies around the country in terms of regionalism, do you think that President Trump will use that to attack Democratic governors and mayors and criticize them for not reopening schools? Basically, just like you said, the spikes in coronavirus, if schools reopen, could be a lose-lose for Trump. Will Trump try and spin it around and turn it into, regardless of what happens with schools, he'll just try and use it to attack his opponents?
Yeah, so I agree. I think Trump, no matter what he does, is going to try to take at least initial results as a victory lap. So, let's just say the schools in the Northeast, by and large, go back the Tuesday after Labor Day. So that's September 8th, if I remember correctly. So let's say September 16th, you don't see a real spike in cases. Trump's going to say we reopened, it's fine, and it's a victory lap. All these hysterics were saying this is going to happen, it didn't happen. I was right the whole time. And I might see an initial bump, but you're going to see the schools. But I think by the time that it reopens, and for enough time, you're going to see that spike in cases I was talking about earlier. And not only is it going to make his victory lap look misguided, it's going to make it look like, George W. Bush standing under the mission accomplished sign on the aircraft carrier, or, 3 years later, or when Iraq has turned into a real mess. It's just, I think it's going to turn around and backfire in a fashion, I think. And then on your governor's point, I think if things do go wrong, Trump will do what he always does and deflect and try to say, well, if Andrew Cuomo did X thing that I wanted, you wouldn't have seen the spike in cases in New York. New York City is actually going to a mixed thing, so I don't know exactly how that will turn out. But let's just say I'm using Cuomo as an example as someone who Trump might attack. And I think that will appeal to his hardcore partisans who are going to say, who are willing to blame things in that. But I don't think it's going to work with independents because they might say, sorry, because by and large, the Democrats have been criticized for being too restrictive, not restrictive enough. And if you see the significant spike in cases because they gave some local areas autonomy to make decisions and they chose to do full reopenings or not fully fleshed out reopenings, then I think that's more likely to vindicate the governors for taking the more cautious approach than result in them losing support or Trump gaining support against Biden through a view, of overcautiousness.
Mm-hmm. And one last thing that I wanted to talk about with you as we approach the end of this segment. We've talked about the political implications, and you've brought some interesting insight, especially on the presidential level, and connected it to the gubernatorial level as well. But some Democratic politicians have expressed concerns, and Republicans too. But for example, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is saying not reopening schools will hurt the economy. And New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy is probably going to follow Andrew Cuomo, at least initially, in opening schools, as long as case transmission levels remain lower than they were earlier this year, especially in the two states and in the tri-state area. So when you look at that, what impact do you think opening or not reopening schools will have on the economy? And how will that in turn impact elections across the country, in your opinion?
Sure. So I think if schools don't reopen, you're going to see a lot of potentially mothers who would go back to the workplace deciding to stay at home, which might decrease their productivity. Or really, I think the broad impact is you'll see whether they remain in the workforce or not remain in the workforce, a movement of women into the home, at least if they stay at home. Even if it's stay at home work, it's that. And I think that can hurt Trump. You also might see families that simply can't afford, or well, actually, no, not them, but you might see higher income families. Is the mother who might have held a job, even if the husband was the primary breadwinner. You might see the mothers decide to stay home. Potentially that can also hurt the economy. And frankly, Trump is losing on the economy already. It getting any worse would only fuel support for Biden. So that again is a way in which this has the potential to backfire for Trump.
Mm-hmm. And we have about 45 seconds left. So before we end the segment, do you just have any other closing statements or important points you want to make to the viewers before you head off?
The only thing I want to emphasize is that even though with the K-12, all of it's lost for Trump, I think Democrats are overly worried about, New Hampshire, which is college heavy and was decided narrowly, being more favorable to Trump just because, you might see Dartmouth or some of the state universities and stuff like that, that out-of-staters attend being closed. And I really think that worry is just misguided. I think that as Kraz emphasized in his article, you really just don't see that kind of risk with higher education, and just because of all the factors involved.
Yeah, well, it's certainly going to be interesting, and the viewers and I appreciate you coming on to provide some insight into education on all levels and how it'll impact the economy and the political climate going into November. So thank you for coming on, Adam. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. So we want to thank our first two panelists, Peter and Adam, for coming on. We're going to have a quick break for about 2 minutes. Please stay with us. Don't leave. We have two more important segments coming up after this, one discussing the key race for Congress with Dane Hammond and Kraz Greinitz. And after that, we have Andrew and Eric debating whether or not Trump populism is the future of the GOP. We'll see you back in 1 minute. Welcome back to the second half of the report, a show dedicated to political, election, and national news updates. Today, we're going to be proceeding with the second half of our show. First, our third segment discussing the race for Congress, and after that, a debate between Eric and Andrew on whether Trump populism is the future of the Republican Party. So we're going to welcome on two panelists tonight. Kraz Greinitz, who's a contributor to Elections Daily and part of our senior staff on our elections team. And we're going to be welcoming Dane Hammond, another contributor for Elections Daily, who's also written for The Medium about certain races and is a frequent guest on our other show on Thursdays, Elections Weekly, which you can watch Thursdays at 6. So we're going to welcome Kraz and Dane to the stream. Welcome, guys. We're happy to have you here. So first off, I was just asking and wondering if you guys could both start by giving an opening statement about what you think the main race for Congress, where the race for Congress stands right now. And when I say race for Congress, I'm talking about Congress as a whole. So basically, where does the momentum stand in the overall elections for the House of Representatives and for the U.S. Senate so far? And we're going to start with Kraz, and then after about a minute, we'll throw it over to Dane.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me. But I think generally, you'd have to look at it and you'd have to think the Democrats are advantaged right now. The generic congressional ballot tracks closely with Biden's lead, which is about 8 or 9 points right now. It's shown no signs of tightening. And in fact, it looks very similar to 2018. In many ways, it looks better than 2018. So I don't really think, there's a possibility that Democrats win the House but lose seats. But I don't really think there's any way you can read the data right now that points to Republicans being favored to take the House or even make significant gains. Poll after poll has looked very subpar for specific Republican candidates. Primary turnout has looked good for Democrats. So I just don't think, at least in my opinion, there's a way to read the data that says that things are going well for the GOP right now.
All right, and I'm going to throw it over to Dane as well to see what he has to say so far about the race for Congress.
I'm on a similar page. I don't think there will really be too many seats that would change hands, like as it stands. I think there would probably be some seats where the Dems beat a GOP incumbent in the House, and other seats where the GOP would be a Dem incumbent. And in the Senate, I would say it's pretty much basically a coin flip at the moment. Like, you've got Colorado, you've got Arizona, which Dems are probably basically bound to gain at this point, and then you've got Maine, where Susan Collins has really fallen off. It's honestly kind of shocking. And then there's NC in Cal Cunningham. That seat will probably end up like determining who wins the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you guys brought up some good points, particularly about the Democrats in terms of favorites at the moment, arguably in the Senate and definitely in the House. And let's talk about the Senate first, because the Senate is obviously currently in Republican hands, but stands a good chance of flipping the Democrats. The Democrats have really focused on this. And originally they started off focusing on their core 4 of races, kind of counting out Alabama because Doug Jones is very vulnerable, seeking re-election as a Democrat in a solidly red state in a presidential year. But they had those core 4, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine. Arizona and Colorado are certainly taken more for granted now. And arguably the core 4 has shifted to North Carolina, Maine, Iowa, and Montana. So I just want to hear your opinions real quick on some of the key Senate races that you think are going to be very important to flipping back the U.S. Senate for the Democrats, and they haven't had control since January 2015. So I'll go to Kraz first, and we'll see what you have to say. So what do you have to say about the key Senate races this year?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's a similar story to the House. I don't really think you can view the data as getting much better for the GOP right now. When you look at North Carolina, Cal Cunningham's had a consistent and strong lead. A few months ago or even a few weeks ago, you might have been able to chalk that up to low name recognition for both candidates. Many polls 3, 4, 5 weeks ago had him leading, 43, 37, 44, 40. But increasingly, he scores in the high 40s, sometimes even low 50s. So that's a positive sign for Democrats. Again, with Susan Collins polls show we're getting crossover support, but just not nearly enough. Those are the two key races, and those are clearly moving in Democrats' direction. In terms of Iowa and Montana, Iowa's more of a mixed bag. It's clearly a toss-up race right now, but we'll see how it goes down the stretch. Joni Ernst has been running, it's generally considered to be a subpar campaign. In Montana, it's a little more questionable which way it's going to go. We haven't had a ton of polling in the last few weeks. Bullock is running close, but we'll see if he can maintain that crossover appeal down the stretch. And also, it's a big question about what the presidential margin in that state is. Trump only got 56%. And polls have shown, Biden getting much closer than Hillary did. So we'll see how that goes down the stretch. But generally speaking, I would say the Democrats are in a strong position in the Senate right now. The playing field is much wider than it was a couple months ago. Georgia's now, a strong possibility for them to flip. So, with the playing field being wider, presidential race being what it is, I think they're in a strong place.
And Dane, what do you think?
So you mentioned having like a core four of NC, Maine, Iowa, and Montana, but I think that you may as well stick Georgia and Texas in those two groups, in that both states are looking really, really close at the national level. Like the polling average in Texas presidentially is dead even in that, and that's got to have some, surely some impact on how MJ Hegar is doing up against John Cornyn.
I mean, I am a bit hesitant about the actual Texas Senate race because I view it as a likely Republican race. I mean, even back in 2018, Beto O'Rourke came within 2 points of taking the Senate seat, but Lupe Valdez lost to Greg Abbott by like a 55-42 margin. So it's possible, and I would not argue with the fact that if Biden comes closer than any other Democrat in a long time to winning Texas, that he will help MJ Hager. But I would also say, especially from what both you guys have brought up, that there are more critical races for the U.S. Senate at this point that Democrats are going to be targeting to a greater degree. Real quick, just touching on some of the races. If you're looking at a state like North Carolina, where arguably Tom Tillis is currently down because his campaign has been run subpar compared to Cunningham, who, even though he doesn't have as much charisma as might be desired in a specific nominee, has had a strong polling advantage. You've also got other factors there. I mean, Roy Cooper is strongly ahead at this point of Dan Forrest in that election, and that could help him down ballot. But my main question is it possible, in your opinion, for Cunningham to unseat Tillis if Trump wins North Carolina? Is there going to be that much of a crossover vote between president and Senate? Not as much as there will be between president and governor, but how big do you foresee the president-Senate crossover vote in North Carolina being? We'll go to Dane first this time.
Yeah.
I would say that state is going to be really, really tight, and I think that's one of the very few ways that could theoretically happen, is if Trump won it by say like 10,000 votes, and Cal Cunningham did about like 1% better. But I overall think that the margin for crossover between Senate and presidential is going to be rather thin.
I mean, back in 2016, as you all know, the crossover margin was fairly thin because the Senate map basically coincided with the presidential map. The Democrats flipped Illinois and New Hampshire, both of which voted for Hillary Clinton. And you had senators in tough reelection bids like Ron Johnson in Wisconsin beat Russ Feingold, who was heavily favored, and then Pat Toomey beat Katie McGinty, all states that Trump won. So my question is, if you have states like Iowa, or North Carolina, if Trump ends up winning those narrowly, or if Biden wins them narrowly, and this goes for Maine too, how much of an impact will they have? Because you have people like Susan Collins who have a long history of getting crossover votes. Like in 2008, she won re-election over Tom Allen, who was a congressman by a big margin, over 60% of the vote, even as Obama cruised to victory in the state over McCain on the same night. And that also plays into Montana. Steve Bullock was re-elected as governor in 2016 on the same night that Trump won the state. Now, some would argue that ticket splitting, and there's evidence of this, is greater between gubernatorial levels and presidential levels than it is between the Senate level and the presidential level. So when we're looking at these people who have proven they can get crossover votes on some level, shifting over to Maine with Collins and Montana with Bullock, how much is this going to apply now in a an election with Trump, who's been called by Larry Sabato as a great polarizer in terms of American politics. And I'll throw it to Kraz first.
Yeah, so I actually have a lot to say about this. It's true gubernatorial races are a lot less partisan than Senate races, but it's worth remembering that even though every Senate race, every state that had a Senate race in 2016 voted the same for Senate as did for president, that doesn't mean there weren't crossover votes. I mean, you saw Jason Kander outperform Hillary Clinton by 17 points. Evan Baugh outperformed her by 10 points. There were other examples. I think, John Hoeven in North Dakota outperformed Trump. And I think it's important to remember. Then you go to 2018, and obviously you saw a lot of crossover support fade. Donnelly lost, McCaskill lost, Heitkamp lost, but again, still Donnelly outrunning Hillary by 13 points, McCaskill outrunning her by 14, Bredesen outrunning her by 15. So I think there's less crossover support than there used to be, but I don't think that it's so deterministic that there's only going to be 1, 2, 3 points of crossover support. I could easily picture some Senate candidates outrunning the top of the ticket by 10, 12 points.
Yeah, and we could definitely see that in states like Montana, where there is expected to be a very close Senate race. And a lot of Republicans have pointed out that Bullock, because he's a Democratic governor in a red state, can't win. But one of the things they seem to leave out is that the Senate candidates who had a history of being former Democratic governors lost those races. They weren't incumbent. It's different being an incumbent. I mean, Bredesen, when he ran in 2018, he hadn't been governor since 2011. And when Ted Strickland ran, again, he hadn't been governor since 2011 when he lost in 2016. Now, both of them lost by wide margins. Early on, Strickland was viewed as having a chance, but then his campaign essentially fell apart. For Bredesen, there were polls that showed Bredesen in the lead. Political had it as a toss-up. I mean, I would argue personally that there's strong evidence to suggest that incumbent governors in challenges usually perform better than former governors running in states that are kind of opposite of their personal political beliefs in terms of their party registration. And what do you guys have to say about this? We're going to wrap up the segment here in a second, but just in general, I would like to hear both of your opinions on how voters, when they're voting in terms of crossovers, how that plays if you're an incumbent governor running like Bullock versus a former governor. And we'll go to Dane first and then Kraz.
Well, I think that one of the biggest things here is that people tie Congress to the president. So in this case, in a state like Montana, people would tie Congress to Donald Trump. So that would probably hurt Bullock more than in, say, a governor's race where Bullock, where you don't quite have those ties to the presidential level that allow him to perform better and get more crossover votes.
Yeah, and just add on to that, being a sitting governor is a huge advantage for crossover votes. Your name recognition is a lot higher. You've been mobilizing the full power of the state's bureaucracy to dole out funding and other policies to citizens for the last 4 years. If you're Bullock, you're governing in the middle of a crisis where you have high approval ratings. People forget Rick Scott pulled off an upset as a sitting governor. Mel Carnahan is a sitting governor, won a Senate race after he died. And yet these former governors have a poor record. So it's clear that being a sitting governor is a huge advantage over being
the public. Governor. It basically shows that the public seems to have a very short memory in terms of voting. I mean, if you're not a political junkie, you'll probably forget a lot of politicians very quickly. So just before we have about 3 minutes left before we're going to go on another short break, but I would like to hear both of your opinions on another issue before we go to closing statements, and that's the House, which we haven't talked about. Could you guys maybe give 3 to 5 seats that the Democrats have a good chance at flipping, and then 3 to 5 that the Republicans have the best chance at flipping? Just to hear from you. If you want, you can add a little short bit of analysis, but just in general, talk about the seats that you're picking for both parties, why they'll flip, and then maybe conclude by analyzing the chamber as a whole. So we're going to go to Kraz first this time.
Yeah, so for Democrats, I think their best chance of flipping seats outside of the redrawn North Carolina districts, obviously, is going to be Texas's 23rd district, probably also Texas's 24th district. I would place that one up there, very high on the list. And then if I had to pick a third,
Georgia's 7th district is what I was going to say.
Yeah. So those 3. For Republicans, the pickings are a little slimmer. I would say New York's 22nd is definitely up there. Minnesota 7th is definitely up there. And rounding out the list, probably I would say Oklahoma's 5th. If I had to, give a third.
And both, and this has turned into a very interesting race, arguably one of the most interesting races for Congress this cycle, between two very good candidates, mind you, and that's Nancy Mace versus Joe Cunningham. Joe Cunningham, the Democrats argue, has a regional brand that's going to carry him to victory, even if Trump wins the district narrowly. But then Nancy Mace is also being touted as one of the best Republican recruits this cycle. So, in your opinion, just to round up your list, would you consider that another one where Republicans could potentially win, or do you think that if Trump underperforms enough in the first district, Cunningham with crossover votes could hold his seat?
So yes, I consider it a very strong possibility for Republicans, but I'll note two things. One, Cunningham has a history of outrunning the top of the ticket. That's important. And two, the polls have been consistently subpar for Donald Trump in South Carolina. Now, granted, some people have been skeptical of them, and I respect that analysis, but ultimately, we've had poll after poll after poll showing him with a single-digit lead, not doing much better than Henry McMaster did 2 years ago in South Carolina. And Henry McMaster only barely won South Carolina's first. So as long as that remains the case, I think that their chances there have decreased significantly since the beginning of the year.
All right, so we have about a minute and a half left. So real quick, I'm just going to hear same question to you, Dane, if you had to make the list for both parties.
So I think that the GOP list would mainly consist of races where of districts that Donald Trump won in 2016 and will again in 2020. And I think that would include like Minnesota 7th and New York 22nd. Those are the two biggest obvious targets for the GOP. And there's obviously like Oklahoma 5th and South Carolina 1st. And one that Cross didn't really bring up was New Mexico's 3rd, which obviously that's a bit weaker of a race for the GOP overall, but Trump won there by a pretty sizable margin. And
you mean the second?
Small barely won there in 2018. As for Dem targets, there's a lot of Sun Belt seats that they've got a chance at, and there's some just classic Rust Belt seats. You've got Texas 23rd is probably the most obvious one with Gina Ortiz-Jones. The 24th, Kansas Valenzuela, definitely a real chance there. Georgia's 7th. Isn't it Carolyn Bordeaux who's running there, I think? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an open seat because Congressman Woodall retired.
Yeah, New Jersey 2nd is one I'm definitely not counting out, given that the Dems have Amy Kennedy running there. And what about Illinois 13th and Betsy Dirksen Landrigan? She's got a lot of connections, so I can't. So I definitely think that's a prime target that's a little bit overlooked.
Yeah, and another seat very similar to that, actually just across the river in Missouri, is the 2nd district. Another district a lot like the 13th, and then it's suburban and trending towards the Democrats. And they have a good recruit against Wagner in Jill Shupp in the state legislature. So we appreciate you guys both coming on tonight, Graz and Dane, to talk about this stuff for our Congress section. So again, thank you guys for coming on.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was the conclusion of our Battle for Congress section. We're going to be moving now to the last 15-minute segment of the show, a debate over whether or not Trump populism is the future of the Republican Party. Will the Republican Party revert back to its previous establishment before Trump's shocking victory in the 2016 primary? Or just like Reagan's conservative revolution, is there a chance that Trump's legacy on the GOP will reshape the party for the decades to come? And for this debate, we're going to be having Eric Cunningham and Andrew Figueredo, and both of them are going to be coming on to discuss this. And Andrew's going to be, I believe I did this correctly. Andrew's going to be arguing that the Trump populism is the future of the party, and Eric's going to be arguing against that. So this is a new segment, debate time. We're going to be having one debate each week, and I'm going to see how it goes. So basically, to just go over the debate, we're going to start, and I'd like you to make clear to the viewers maybe like where your ideology leans politically, if you're talking about liberal, centrist, conservative, before we start. And then after that, it's going to be opening statements from each person, and then we're going to have some time for rebuttal after that, back and forth, and then we'll close, just like a standard debate. So we're probably going to I'll just pick someone, but in the future I'll have a coin toss for who goes first, if that's okay with you guys. So if you could just start by introducing yourself to the viewers and maybe just saying a quick little bit about your political views so the viewers know why you're taking the stand you're taking. So yeah, we'll start with Eric first.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So for me personally, I definitely lean on the traditionally conservative end of the Republican Party. So more of a movement conservative. On most issues, I'd say I'm generally conservative. Economic ones are the ones where I'm the most conservative or the most traditionally right wing on those issues. And so that's kind of where I come from here. And just looking at the last few years, I think you look at people like Thomas Massey, who made a pretty revealing comment, I believe, which is that when Donald Trump had won the nomination, when he started winning, or not when Donald Trump won it, when he started winning races and Justin Amash started winning races, they assumed the libertarian moment was here. When it was actually, in his words, that the Republicans were just electing the craziest son of a bitch out there. That remains a very real possibility that Donald Trump is, in fact, that person, the person who was kind of got into a sort of Tea Party populist flair. But if you ultimately look at the legacy of the Tea Party, is what I really want to go back to. What is the legacy of the Tea Party? Most of its star recruits ultimately turned out to be establishment conservatives or typical backbenchers along that line. So that's kind of where I'm going to kind of go from here.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. Now we're going to go to Andrew. If you could introduce yourself too to the viewers. We're happy to have you on for the first time as a guest on the report.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm really appreciative of this. So I would not consider myself politically a conservative, even though I am philosophically kind of conservative. On Twitter, I refer to myself as a left conservative. So I believe that the government can play a role and should play a role in bettering the fortunes of people. I'm a Democrat. I am more of a socially conservative Democrat. So I lean left on economics, and I'm more in the middle on social issues. The thrust of my argument is that I don't think the party necessarily is going to be Trump's party in the future, especially if he gets the kind of striking down in the Electoral College that it currently looks like he's headed toward. But I think that even the Tea Party, Reaganism, the Tea Party, the Gingrich 1990s revolution, they all left their imprint upon American conservatism in one way or another. So it's not going to irretrievably be a Trump party. But for instance, I could see a more protectionist angle within the Republican Party taking precedent. I think polling shows right now that Democrats, in fact, now favor free trade more than Republicans did, when in the early 1990s, it was Republicans who actually got NAFTA over the line for President Bill Clinton. So we've already seen a reversal and a realignment on that front, and I can foresee a lot of other issue areas that I think we'll get to discuss.
Okay, so now that you guys have introduced yourselves and kind of talked about what you're going to do for your arguments, we're going to start with opening statements, basically where you're going to make your arguments to the viewers. So since Eric started first last time, we'll let Andrew start first this time. In the future, I'll have a coin toss, but if you're both okay with it, that's how we're going to do it today.
Yeah,
so
that works fine for me.
All right, so Andrew, you can have the first 2 minutes to introduce your argument, and then we'll throw it off to Eric.
Great. So essentially continuing off of what I started to mention, I think that every moment that rises and falls within the conservative tent, which I think is a very broad one, leaves some kind of imprint, right? I think that the Trump moment in the Republican Party, first of all, is not something that is unparalleled. I wrote an article about some antecedents of Trump that we saw within the Republican Party, beyond just the obvious, Pat Buchanan in 1992, 1996. There have been voices within the party that have spoken about isolationism, that have spoken about the notion of America first for many, many years. I mean, going back to even Taft in the 1950s was an isolationist. H.R. Gross of Iowa was another great example. And of course, more recently, you've had certain Republicans who have a more populist lean to them. But I think what Trump did is he opened the floodgates to a whole new discussion. Whether Donald Trump himself actually believes what he says is a whole other story. But Steve Bannon and kind of the acolytes around the Trump campaign early on established that they were going to push back against neoliberalism, which is a trend, broadly speaking, that has taken the lead in both parties. And when Trump did that, never mind the fact that I don't think he's governed like the true populist that he promised to be. The tax cut bill made that very clear, for instance, and so many other examples exist. But Trump has begun to question the dominance of kind of a globalized elite class. It's a revolt of the somewheres versus the anywheres, as Goodhart would put it in a British context, or the peripheral America, as Christophe Guilly might refer to it in the US. Whereas Trump has really started to change things in opposing TPP, in fighting for the renegotiation of NAFTA. These are things that conservatives, for the most part, did not stand up for. And right now, one point I will concede to Eric is that the populists within the Republican Party lack a real infrastructure, but they're building that with Orrin Cass, Yuval Levin, some of the reformicons are coming around to it. So I think that we're seeing a growing populist movement within the party, a recognition that they need to win over working class voters, and the fact that Trump already blew open the floodgates, so we're talking about a lot of new ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. You brought up some good points there. Now we're going to go to Eric for his 2-minute opening statement about his argument. So, Eric, feel free to start.
Yep. So one way I like to think about this is if we look at wave elections, typically you can tell an ideological shift within a party when something has happened. In 1980, you saw a lot, not only did Reagan win, you saw a lot of Reagan-style conservatives win. 1994, the conservative revolution saw a ton of insurgent Republicans kind of getting rid of the what I call the Bob Dole wing of the party that were more traditionally concerned, not necessarily moderate, but more concerned with debt and deficits. You saw the more Brian Kemp or Jack Kemp wing of the party, who are more interested in tax cuts and spurring the economy and some specific other elements that became compassionate conservatism. Even if Jack Kemp was never able to become president or vice president himself, those ideas lived on. And for full disclosure, I really like Jack Kemp. I consider him someone who I think I connect with. But if you look at 2016 and 2018, it's hard to really identify candidates who ran on and were elected on a populist platform. You can count Donald Trump for sure, but you have to consider that he did not win a majority of the vote in the Republican primary, and he didn't even win. He didn't win the popular vote either. He actually, in a lot of these states where it was very touted that he had improved, these were states where he went from 45% for Romney to 47%, where he only equaled what George W. Bush was able to accomplish. If you look at down ballot, it's very similar. In 2016, most Republicans outran him. In 2018, you saw a couple of people, for example, Josh Hawley being the most notable, who has adopted this platform himself, but he didn't run on that platform. He ran with the endorsement of the Koch brothers. He ran specifically, if you went to his website before and after the election, it's kind of night and day what he ran on versus what he is. He didn't run, for example, on banning Facebook or on restricting that. He didn't run on a lot of the things he's talking about now. And it's the same with people like Marco Rubio or Tom Cotton, where they've kind of politically opportunistic have kind of jumped on the bandwagon. I would argue that Marco Rubio jumping on your bandwagon is kind of a death knell for your movement. I know this personally, given I supported him in 2016 and watched him basically destroy the forward-looking wing of the party in that regard, when he'd previously been in multiple other wings. So when I look at the party right now, I don't see populists winning. Even this last election, last few weeks have been disastrous for populists. Jeff Sessions lost in a landslide in his in the runoff race for the Senate election in Alabama, despite aggressive backing from populists like Ryan James Gerdusky, Ann Coulter, Michelle Malkin, people along those lines who have really adopted that line. And then just last week, Chris Kobach, aggressively pushed by the same folks, in fact, inspired a lot of them on Twitter to complain about the Republican primary electorate not being in their same agenda. So that's where I kind of look at it. I don't see the Republican voter looking at Trump necessarily like, you know what I love about Trump? I love the trade wars, and I love the protectionism, and I love unions. I don't think that's what they look at him for. I think they see he's aggressively fighting for socially conservative issues or for religious liberty or for any of these other things. And then that stuff is just, if they care about it, it's a bonus. The free trade thing, I would push back on just a little bit. I want to just push back on that slightly, because if you look at the polls historically, the party in power tends to oppose free trade or oppose free trade, while the party out of power tends to support it. It tends to oscillate pretty rapidly between parties. That's just kind of where I'm looking at it from the baseline of someone who's been watching this very closely and who's written about this for Ordinary Times, several articles on this topic so far.
Yeah, you guys both brought up some good points that I find interesting. And another thing, a historical connection that is also incredibly interesting. Obviously, as you all know, in the 19th century, in the latter half, when the Republican Party was formed and began to flourish, especially post-Civil War, they were a very protectionist party with regard to trade. I mean, Republicans used tariffs to raise revenue. Even as late as the 1930s, President Hoover, even though he didn't agree with it, was forced into signing the tariff to combat the Depression, and it did not work as planned. But a lot of people before the Trump era viewed the Republican Party as the quintessential free trade party, but the Republican Party at its roots even though obviously back in the Civil War times it was created as a party for social justice and liberty for freed slaves and stopping the expansion of slavery. Even back then, they focused on a very, you could say, populist economic message that has somewhat changed and may now be reverting back to that. So I'll have you guys review and toss it back and forth, and you can discuss other things as well. But what do you think about that potential for some aspects of the Republican Party to go back to its roots?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that, I give Eric this point for sure, that it's going to be tougher to inspire long-term change, and that a lot of it, I think, has been opportunistic. But I think that the opportunism might end up kind of burrowing its way into the party. We already see outlets like National Review, which were kind of like the home of more steady conservatism, starting to publish articles that are decidedly from more populist angles or more populist authors. I think it's more of a shift in ideas and in rhetoric, especially. Take, for instance, Elise Stefanik from upstate New York. She was kind of ambivalent about Trump throughout much of the 2016 election, but has now become one of his most full-throated endorsers and fans in Congress. I'm not saying that every person in Republican in Congress is like Matt Gaetz or anything, God forbid. But I think that people like Jim Banks, Greg Steube, some of the newer people in Congress were more reflective of the Trump agenda. I don't think, again, that it's a very genuine populism. I shared an article earlier about how the Republicans still have a very long way to go before they can be a genuinely populist party and really stand up for a multiracial working class coalition. But even the rhetoric of some of these more establishment figures like Roger Marshall, they're talking about being tough on China. This is not something that a party that the majority of them voted for PNTR in the early 2000s. This isn't something you would expect, right? This more nationalistic, economically nationalistic rhetoric has begun to percolate among the reaches of kind of the more respectable and establishment conservatives. So while I think that they might not actually take substantive policy steps just yet, we're starting to see the ideas take root in the Republican Party.
And Eric, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely some truth in that. The most likely scenario, if they want to do it, is to integrate within the Republican Party, to rather than try to get rid of a stool. Many of these so-called national conservatives, as many of them call themselves, see themselves as removing the fiscal conservatives from the party altogether, just getting rid of that leg of the stool, and replacing themselves with that. That's not how political parties work. That's not how coalitions work in a big tent system. That's not a realistic desire. Their best scenario would be to make themselves a fourth leg in the stool, alongside fiscal, social, and foreign policy conservatism. I would push back on the notion that a lot of the China stuff is economic. I think much of this is from a foreign policy perspective, and particularly from a geographic and realistic perspective. So, for example, Nikki Haley, who is mostly considered to be a fairly typical conservative, Orrin Cass has called her a market fundamentalist, which I consider to be kind of an insult term. But she has been very tough on China from a human rights and from a foreign policy standpoint, while simultaneously remaining values of free trade and economics. That's very different from someone who thinks fundamentally, like Trump does, that the bad thing about China isn't the Uyghur concentration camps or any of this other stuff. It's the trade deals. That's his fundamental opposition to China. The most of the Republicans I know, and the Republicans who are open to that, even people like myself, are very open to restrictions on China from a national security standpoint. So I would kind of push back a little bit on that as that being indicative. One thing I do think will be interesting to look at is how those institutions that have tried to establish themselves, specifically people like Orrin Cass and American Compass, and then other outlets like American Mind, American Greatness, and the American Conservative, try to position themselves, because they're actually positioning themselves outside the movement for the moment. Obviously, the American Conservative has never been, despite its name, has never been really affiliated with the American conservative movement. Movement conservatism, as we call it, during the 2000s. Many of its articles were openly pro-Kerry or pro-Obama and very much aggressively anti-Bush. And even into the future, as recently as 2012, you have people like Bruce Bartlett writing articles extolling the values of Barack Obama. That's very much not normalized in the Republican Party. The same thing is what I see with American Compass, is rather than staying at the institution he was at, which is what I believe the Manhattan Institution, Rayhan Salam runs it and is very much someone who's ideologically on point with that agenda. He made this new outlet, hired several leftist, outwardly left-leaning individuals, labor leaders, left-wing sort of populists like Matt Stoller, and in that regard has actually distanced himself from the conservative movement, which makes it trickier to try to integrate within it. I've thought, for example, I mentioned in an article I wrote for Ordinary Times that many of his ideas would likely become more like the Heritage Foundation idea for Obamacare in the 1990s, where this was just kind of thrown out there. And Democrats ultimately picked up on it and were able to say, well, one conservative organization said something nice about this a long time ago, so this is conservative and you should agree with it. I could see Democrats doing that with, for example, a wage subsidy or with collective bargaining, union bargaining, and sector bargaining and different regulations along that line. The problem is in the Republican Party, you have to change minds on the issue. Yeah. And in recent polls, the number of social conservatives have declined in the Republican Party, while the number of fiscal conservatives have stayed about steady. Keep in mind, Trump's biggest policy objective win was a fiscally conservative, traditionally Reaganite tax cut. Granted, it got rid of the SALT deduction. No conservatives were crying over that. That was arguably a populist move. That just from my perspective, at least what I'm seeing. I think they're developing a movement that's external to the party that can give some pressure. But like the paleo conservatives of old, that only does so much. You have to actually win primaries. And unless you win primaries or convert elected officers into your position, it's really difficult to have a lot of say in the matter.
Mm-hmm. So we've heard both your arguments now, and we're going to start wrapping up the show. So in the final 2 minutes, could both of you just give a 1-minute closing statement on your argument and talk about how your argument, if it pans out to be that way for the Republican Party, and how that will impact future electoral successes or failures for the Republican Party in 2024 and beyond. And try to keep it brief, but if you can just touch on how you think whether populism goes or whether it stays, and how that will impact Republican electoral coalitions going forward. So we'll go to Andrew first.
Great. I think, first of all, it's not going to take over the entire agenda, but I could see it, as Eric states, becoming part of that stool if it is able to work its way into the movement. I think that this is an electoral advantage for the Republican Party because it allows them to reach out to voters, especially Hispanic voters, African-American voters who are still picking the Democrats, but whose views on social issues align more conservative with their economic views leaning left. I think this is a formula we've seen replicated around the world. Boris Johnson, even some of the left-leaning parties in Europe, such as Mette Frederiksen in Denmark, have undermined the right by appealing to that top left quadrant of their society. So if Republicans can effectively de-racialize, as David Brooks put it in a great piece a few days ago, move slightly left on economics due to the pressure of the populists, and maintain some social traditional views and maybe moderate a little on the culture wars, I think they can really drive a dagger through the heart of the Democratic Party. And as a Democrat, that's something I'm very concerned about.
And Eric, do you want to give your closing statement as well?
Yeah. So ultimately, I think the most likely scenario depends on how Trump performs in 2020. It's no secret that a lot of Republicans are only reluctantly on board, and even many voters are only on board with him as long as they perceive him as winning. If he were to lose resoundingly, as the polls indicate, having Republican issues in many states while losing many of the states he gained in 2016, I have the feeling that would be kind of a quick death knell for the populist movement, at least for the time being. If he were to narrowly win, or if Republicans were to somehow manage to have gains, I think that would put him in a much stronger position. Ultimately, I think there's room for some people on the fringes like this, but the problem becomes where you still have to either replace those voters who already exist or convert ones who don't know it. For example, I know people who watch Tucker Carlson every night, but they only do it because of they just want a different perspective. They don't do it because they agree with him on everything, and that Elizabeth Warren's economic policy is terrific and stuff along that line. So ultimately, and the other big thing is that the immigration reform stuff will have to be dealt with in some manner in order for this movement to have a whole lot of success. That really does, a lot of these elements are more nativist or immigration reductionist, which makes it a little bit challenging to appeal to those voters. It's not a situation that can't be overcome, but it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to require more than just one election and then announcing yourself as the imperial victor and marching a victory parade in Rome. But that's not really how it works. You have to take time to do these sorts of things.
Yeah, so thank you guys very much. We provided a lot of insight for the viewers about the future of the Republican Party and whether or not you think populism will be pertinent to the Republican message going forward in future elections. And I think you guys also touched on how, in a way, even though there's no decisive outcome yet, we don't know for sure until we analyze how Trump's administration matches up historically a few decades from now. But there's a possibility, at least now, the Republican Party is heading back towards the old iteration of itself originally, where you had a lot of protections, economic policies, all the way up to the Smoot-Hawley tariff that, as I mentioned earlier, President Hoover signed to try and avert the Depression. And I think it's all very interesting what you brought up. So we really appreciate having you guys on for our debate segment. I think the viewers and I like the fact that we can have two people that are competing for the debate title. I mean, there is no title, but in terms of providing competing views, this is definitely a segment we're going to keep going forward. So really, thank you guys very much for coming on this episode. And we hope to have you both on in the future again. I mean, obviously Eric, because he's the founder and editor-in-chief of Elections Daily, is on often, but Andrew, you're welcome to come back as well, because you really provided some very insightful commentary and were very knowledgeable on everything that you talked about. So yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you. And before I head off real quick, I do want to recommend, I wrote an article for Ordinary Times a while back, if you just search my name on there, about some of these new coalitions that have been emerging within the Republican Party, which includes not only national conservatives, but also reactionary anti-Trump conservatives and some other wings. That kind of gives an idea of the sort of dynamics we're talking about here.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
All right, that was the conclusion of episode 4 of the report. We hope you enjoyed this episode and all of its segments. With that, we're going to sign off for the night. Thank you for watching the report, and we hope to see you next week on Monday. Also, if you're free tomorrow, please watch our election coverage. We have many critical primaries tomorrow. And playing into our debate message, there actually is a runoff tomorrow in Georgia's 14th district between Marjorie Taylor Greene, who definitely represents the new right populism wing of the Republican Party, running against John Cohen. Both candidates are conservative, but Greene has become more controversial, and it'll be interesting to see if Republicans continue their streak of having good candidates that the National Party would view as more electable running, or whether or not they're going to pick someone more in the mold of a further right populist. It is important to note that the district is safe Republican, so the primary is tantamount to victory. But please give that a watch on YouTube. Like and subscribe to Elections Daily, and check out our content from our bipartisan group of contributors. One thing that makes us special is we have a unique group of contributors from various ideologies to balance it out. I mean, as you saw tonight, for every debate night, we're going to try and have, especially if we debate more hardline political issues, someone from both sides of the spectrum. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you next week.